Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to discuss how operations strategy is different in a global environment. So why do we care about the global environment when we're looking at operations management? Part of the reason is just the sheer growth of international markets. And this chart is just to show you how the world GDP has grown over the years. So if you look at, with the growth of e-commerce, with the last 50 years of free trade agreements, if you look throughout the world, more and more countries are reducing their tariffs and opening up their markets. So there's all kinds of opportunities, and these opportunities have to be managed throughout these organizations. So what are some of the reasons that a company will globalize or an organization will globalize? Well, one reason is to improve their supply chain. So, for example, I've worked with many agricultural companies, and in the agriculture business, you have to supply your customers all year round, not just, oranges or apples or avocados when it's in season in one place, but you have to be able to access the same product throughout the world. So that requires you to grow throughout the world. Getting unique inputs to your finished products. So that's one way that companies globalize. Another is to reduce costs and possibly take advantage of foreign exchange rate risks. In other words, looking at places where certain inputs might be cheaper, either because labor's cheaper or maybe because that country concentrates on that particular product and they have economies of scale that we may not have here. To improve operations, again, with organizations, any given product or service may be made up of a number of skill sets or a number of different inputs. And it's good to look at those markets that most efficiently have those products, but also how they have efficiencies through operations with those different components. In other words, you might see that certain technologies or certain human capital is better in another country than our comparative skill sets. So that's one way to improve operations. Also, too, you can learn, open innovation isn't just about products, but it's also about processes. So that's another reason that companies globalize. It's important to understand markets. Literally, every single country that you go to requires you to change your business model in some way. Does your supply chain look different? Does your scheduling look different? The way that you manage people. So understanding markets is really important because it not only leads to efficiencies, but it enables you to expand into other markets, finding other customers, and expanding your profits and your reach as a brand. Improving products. So I alluded to the whole idea of open innovation or innovation through other partners. There's a lot of good cases out there of companies that have gone into foreign markets to access types of innovation which result in the improvement of their products. In fact, I would argue that international business is largely an exercise of companies innovating their business models, right? Because they have to, each country that they go to, they have to be able to innovate. So innovation is really at the heart of accessing global markets because you need that flexibility to be able to adapt to those markets. Another aspect, which I mentioned just a little bit ago, is attracting and retaining global talent. So this is a real important reason to globalize because you can access talents and skill sets, again, that you might not have in your home country. So a lot of companies look to where the talent is. And more of that talent is global, both here and abroad. Another reason to globalize is to improve the supply chain. So locating facilities closer to your resources. So a lot of companies have their automotive design in California because that's where a lot of the automotive design talent is. You might have shoe production in China because, again, the skill sets or the supply chain is there. In other words, if you try to make shoes in a country that doesn't have a healthy supply chain, they may not be able to support all the inputs. So think again, if you had a shoe production company, you would have to have productions that are very close to each other for textiles, for the rubber that makes the soles, Kevlar for heel supports. So you have to have a whole ecosystem of different types of capabilities to make up your production. Perfume manufacturing in France, again, that's a place that has a rich history of that type of product. So there's a lot of suppliers, the supply chain is there, the customers are there, the designers are there. So again, it's looking to those markets that have a comparative advantage with that particular product. Again, in reducing costs, there may be certain risks with currency exchange rates. So when operations managers look to expand into foreign markets, they have to carefully consider the impact of exchange rates. In other words, the costs may be low, but the exchange rates may be volatile in a certain country, and you have to account for that in your overall costing. Reducing direct and indirect costs. So within the global supply chain, it's very important to look at not only what those direct costs are, the costs of manufacturing, but what are the impacts of some of those indirect costs? Some of the in human resource, maybe the training takes longer to train up personnel in that particular market. So you may have to look at that as a consideration. Another consideration that'll help reduce costs is looking at free trade agreements. So there's a variety of different structures that can lower tariff costs. And again, a tariff is basically a tax on an import. So as much as you can have domestic costs, tariffs relate to those costs related to international trade, mostly on the import side. So there are programs such as the maquiladoras throughout Mexico that provided basically free trade zones in order to manufacture goods specifically for the purposes of export. There's the World Trade Organization that's established a number of tariff relief programs. There's what used to be the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now the USMCA, which is a trade agreement between US, Mexico, and Canada, provides in most cases duty-free treatments for goods that originate from one or more of those three countries, or one or all of those three countries. And then there's the European Union. So there's, within Europe, the European Union shares common tariffs. They share common regulations, which can also reduce costs. So it's very important for operations managers to look when they're looking at site location, when they're looking at overseas factories, when they're looking at facilities, their investments. It's very important to pay special attention to these types of free trade agreements. In improving operations, understanding the difference between how businesses handle in other countries is very important. In Japan, they're very good at inventory management. Their processes are very good. In Germany, they pioneer robotics, especially within the automotive field. Scandinavians very much have a lot of technology within ergonomics. So if you look at each one of those countries' strengths, you can see how you can leverage each one of those to enhance the quality of your operations. And looking at customer response times, customer expectations. So a lot can be learned in improving your operations by looking at how operations are run in different countries, what their management styles are, and what their strengths are. It's very important to understand markets. So as I mentioned before, interacting with foreign customers, not all customers are driven the same way. In fact, I remember having a conversation with an executive at Disney. And one of the things this executive told me is how they had distinct penetration strategies that were very different between China and India. They found that in China, a lot of their market strategies were centered around products, toys, dolls, different types of goods. Whereas in India, a lot of their lead-in strategy was centered around movies. So even though they had the same content in both countries, they might lead in with a toy or a product in one country and then bring the movie content in, whereas another country, the lead-in was film and media followed by products. So consumers can be very different from country to country. Not only are the consumers different, but the suppliers can be different too. The expectations of the suppliers. You may go into a low-cost market and you have to be very careful about quality issues, process issues, what the supply chain looks like. On the other hand, you may have other supply markets that have very high standards for quality, but you have to look very closely at culture, how you interact with them to get the products and services you need. Competition can also lead, though, to additional opportunities. And we find this when companies go global, the competition becomes global. New competitors force new innovations, force new technologies. So very much going global and understanding those competitors in those foreign markets can often lead to very good improvements within your operation. Again, following the idea of products. Products can be improved through the free flow of ideas. In other words, open innovation, working with your partners, working with your strategic arrangements. For example, both Toyota and BMW manage joint research and development within the automobile industry. This helps them reduce risk, state-of-the-art design, as well as lowering costs. Samsung and Bosch jointly produce batteries. So there's a lot of these interesting strategic alliances that are global in nature that can help companies leverage them against their larger competition. Attracting and maintaining global talent. This is getting to be more and more of an issue as companies expand globally. So understanding the growth opportunities and insulating against unemployment. Looking at expatriates is another big issue within an organization. As companies go global and their management travels from country to country, it's very important to look at what it takes to retain those expatriates, as well as working with your employees in different markets, understanding the culture. In fact, a researcher, Geers Hofstede, did a lot of research within cultural, and he developed his cultural dimensions, which looked at the differences between culture within an organization all throughout the world. And there could be many different types of differences. Ethical issues, social behavior can differ. International laws, agreements. So when you think about a company that goes global, they not only have to consider their laws locally within their home country, but now they have to start to consider the laws in other countries. How is intellectual property managed? How are agreements looked at? Verbal agreements versus written agreements. What are the codes of conduct and ethical behavior, and how are they different from, say, the US to China to Europe to Latin America? So it's very important to look at those cultural and ethical issues and see how they impact your company. As goods and information and people are mobile throughout the organization, they're all types of capital. It's very important to look at these cultural and ethical issues that can arise from that. So things that companies want to consider when they're going global is the national literacy rate. This can affect and impact the costs of training, the cost of retention of talent. The rate of innovation. How important is the rate of innovation when expanding into those markets? It might have a big impact if you're working with potential suppliers in a given country. The rate of technology change. Is the rate of technology going to keep up with the requirements of your company? The skilled workforce. You may go into a country that has low labor costs, but again may have a shortage of the right types of skills that you need to maintain and operate your company. Political stability. This is very, very critical. Looking at the long run, what is that country, if you're going to start investing within a country, if you're going to start alliances, trading products, what's the political stability of that country, long range? Product liability laws. Product liability laws can be different from country to country, and products have to be designed, managed, and organizations therefore adapted to those liability laws. And product liability laws can be radically different from country to country. Export restrictions. Some companies choose to go global by simply just exporting their product and setting up supply chains in those countries by working with partners. But in some cases, because of export restrictions, they may be compelled to set up operations within that country. Variations in language. It's so important that you account for those variations in language. What type of language support is required to operate in certain countries? You may have your number one market for a particular product or a need in a supply in a foreign country. You may have a number one product in a certain country, but you may go to the number two country for that product simply because of variations in language. Work ethic is very important. Every company has its work culture, and sometimes the work culture from one firm to another or setting up in a foreign country can be radically different. So that has to be accounted for. Tax rates. This comes up all the time, even within working with NAFTA countries. In the US, we don't have value-added taxes, but for example, in both Canada and Mexico, there is a value-added tax that has to be considered. There are other kinds of tax rates too, both local as well as tariffs that have to be considered. Inflation rates. What are the inflation trends within the country that you're working with? Is it a country that's very volatile, or is it a country such as China that really has very low inflation rates? The availability of raw materials. One of the reasons a company goes global is because there might be a better availability of certain materials from one country to another. But you have to look at the entire purchasing supply chain to make sure that the requirements of your product are being met within the countries that you operate. Population. Population heavily influence your consumer decisions, your decisions to go into certain target markets. For example, Disney is heavily reliant upon the middle class. That's who their target customers are. So they're very attuned to what percentage of the population represents a middle class wage within any particular population, any particular country. What is the transportation infrastructure? You may have a wonderful client potential in a country, or you may source a really good supplier within a country, but that supplier or quality of delivery to a customer is only as good as the transportation supply chain infrastructure within that country. Communication systems. As the world is more and more digital every day, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's meetings on Zoom, communication infrastructure and systems are very important to consider. So looking at all this, you have to look at what the overarching strategy is within an organization. So you have to have an action plan to achieve your company's mission. You have to look at the functional areas of strategy, strategies to exploit opportunities, strengths, neutralize threats and weaknesses. So some of the strategies to think about for competitive advantage is differentiation. Is it better or is it at the least different? Is it cost leadership? In other words, are your goods cheaper? Or are you simply not necessarily cheaper or that different, but you have better response times? So all of these things can be things that you create strategies around, right? So types of differentiation. You may have experience differentiation. In other words, you engage customers through experiences. In other words, theme parks is a good example. Movie theaters, restaurants. So you're selling an experience. And the idea of selling, differentiating through experience is very key, because as you look at how world markets are growing and the middle class around the world is growing, there's more and more of a need for service. And that need for service often translates into selling the customer experience. In competing on cost, it's very important to align yourself globally with looking how you best achieve those lower costs. Does that mean that you source the same kind of product but in different locations in order to maintain lower costs? Do you cut certain types of frills out in order to maintain those lower costs? So all of these things need to be looked at. Competing on response, and again, this as the need for service throughout the world grows, so is the need to differentiate through your response. So that could be flexibility in meeting orders, flexibility in being agile and looking at returns, reliability in schedules, quickness of design. So again, as the middle class grows, as throughout the world, as service is in more demand, agility of the business model is also accelerating. So response times are a very important part of differentiation. So again, all of this has to be looked at in the context of some kind of analysis. So again, most of you are familiar with the SWOT analysis, but it still bears mentioning. In a SWOT analysis, you look at your internal weaknesses, your internal strengths, your mission. And I like to take it a little bit further, not only the organization's mission, but the organization's point of view on the problem that you're trying to solve. Looking at what those external opportunities are, wherever they are in the world, as well as looking at those external threats, which in a global context can be any one of a number of things throughout your business model. And then putting that together into a cohesive strategy. Now, for this class, I will have a separate video looking at what I call an industry analysis or Porter's 5-force analysis. And again, as much as a SWOT analysis looks at these internal weaknesses and threats, a 5-force analysis looks at how an industry can have impact on a company's profits and efficiencies. So again, if you have any other questions, please reach out to me. And again, we'll talk again in our next class. So take care, everyone.